So this paper involves some lists, which may be a little hard to compass when I'm just telling them out loud. So if you feel yourself drifting into confusion, that might actually be part of my point. We can just all get a little confused together. So this is enumerating myth, roughing it, and the disorder of things. Roughing it is undoubtedly a complicated narrative. In tone and often in content, it consciously derails approaches central to common depictions of the mythical American West, in a way that broadly aligns with Twain's irreverence for convention, both social and genre-specific. But its gleeful participation in archetypal Western activities such as mining, stagecoaching, and claim staking can't help but reify central tenets of that mythos, even as the story seems to poke fun at what one might call the assumed nobility of the American settler. Along these lines, my paper will focus on one key formal element of roughing it that similarly and paradoxically reinforces and refutes conventions familiar to travel narratives roughing it cannot help but find itself in conversation with: the chapter argument, or the descriptive list assigned to the beginning of each chapter of the novel. As I outline below, my contention is that Twain, carefully structures the arguments introducing roughing its chapters to evoke an unsettling sense of incoherence, which aligns with his project as a whole. My paper begins with an analysis of Michel Foucault's The Order of Things. Interrogating the modern principles of order we largely take for granted, Foucault analyzes a list from Jorge Luis Borges' 1942 essay, The Analytical Writings of John Wilkins. It's a fictional thing that he's analyzing. In that essay, Borges discusses a fictional taxonomy, supposedly scraped from an ancient Chinese encyclopedia, called the Celestial Emporium of Benevolent Knowledge. This list of animals reads as follows, quote, A, those that belong to the emperor. B, embalmed ones. C, those that are trained. D, suckling pigs. E, mermaids. F, fabulous ones. G, stray dogs. H, those that are included in this classification. I, those that tremble as if they were mad. J, innumerable ones. K, those drawn with a very fine camel's hair brush. L, others. M, those that have just broken a flower vase. N, those that resemble flies from a distance. According to Foucault, quote, in the wonderment of this taxonomy, the thing we apprehend in one great leap, the thing that is demonstrated as the exotic charm of another system of thought, is the limitation of our own, the stark impossibility of thinking that. Foucault ultimately experiences a sort of psychic revulsion in the presence of this list, not precisely because of any written or descriptive absurdity, but because the Emporium awakens in us the suspicion that, quote, there is a worse kind of disorder than that of the incongruous. Along these lines, Foucault orders Borges' list simply, this is a quote, simply dispenses with the sight, the mute ground upon which it is possible for entities to be juxtaposed. The category, those that are included in this classification, for example, fractures the relationship between container and contained, destroys, in Foucault's words, quote, the and of enumeration by making impossible the in where the things enumerated would be divided up. This is not simply an instance of juxtaposition of extremes, although the list is certainly well described as incongruous. Instead, is an exercise in the destruction of one of the very vehicles through which we articulate order, the order we continually oppose upon the world. The entry innumerable ones seems absurd on its face, but is only when viewed as part of a list purporting to be both ordered and benevolent that we are forced to attempt a futile reconciliation between the impossibility of containing the innumerable and the neatly organized letters that punctuate the list. Roughing It doesn't quite reach these levels of eldritch horror, but it is certainly full of incongruity and disorder. And while it is not the only one of his books to include chapter arguments, although they function quite differently in works of explicit fiction such as Huck Finn, it is well worth pointing out that such arguments are quite common in travel narratives of the American West, so much so that novelist Cormac McCarthy, taking cues from his source material, uses them as late as 1985 in his revisionist Western Blood Meridian. By applying Foucault's methodology from the order of things to roughing its arguments, we are able to parse out what exactly Twain accomplishes by including within list descriptions, which are largely legible and genre standard, such items as, quote, another delusion dispelled, when a first delusion has not been mentioned, quote, a spoiled watermelon, and, quote, overcoats as an article of diet. After all, while the West in America can be said to often represent disorder, wildness, and individualism in the popular mind, isn't the purpose of the traditional travel narrative and the process of American expansion as a whole to conceptually civilize and pacify in the name of coherence and stability? Twain's use of unreadable arguments would therefore inflict a particularly acute irony on the reader. Our desire for the West as a space of adventure hinges on tales of extra-civilizational disorder, but the format through which we present those journeys uses the stability of its framework, the recognizable narrative, the application of familiar politics, the relatable desires of its inhabitants, to tame the spaces and experiences traversed in the writing. The truer desire, etched in the process, would then necessarily be our longing for a place of fragile misrule, which can thrill temporarily, which inevitably resolves into the familiar solaces of recognizable social, logical, and linguistic orders. One can say then that by disrupting the site of myth-making's supposed coherence, Twain produces the incoherence of those conflicting desires and offers in their place an, again, ironically, more representative account of the granular chaos of the individual experience of expansion. As a contrast, let us take the arguments offered in J.M. Peck's 1836 New Guide to the West, best known for providing the historical basis, such as it is, for Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis. Peck's guide attempts to delineate all manner of characteristics, experiences, and customs found in the West of his day, which is closer to what we would consider the Midwest, so Ohio, Indiana, Missouri, and Michigan. Peck's arguments generally constrain themselves, offering bullet-pointed list of topics covered within a given state or territory, and rarely straying into overt narrative. His chapter on Indiana, for example, begins, as many of the others do, with, quote, boundaries and extent, and continues with such entries as counties, population, sketch of each county, form of government, finances, pretty standard stuff, before concluding with a brief history of the territory and some general remarks from Peck. But while there is no overt narrative to this list, inverting Foucault's approach outlined above allows us to understand the impact of the structure itself. The argument insists on ordering, containing, and accounting the West, both land and people. The irony here is clear. Peck positions himself as a purveyor of the exotic, a region which, in his words, so particularly excites the attention of the immigrant, but he also understands what a prime use of the travel narrative is to pacify the wilderness by virtue of the structured, orderly manner in which it presents the world. Within the managed spaces of Peck's arguments, the unbridled chaos and unknowability of the frontier collides with another desire, which unites individual and nation, the desire to tame and assimilate. The unexciting, almost actuarial presentation of information and the very curation of knowledge that he offers, generally, performs American control of the land by converting the complex, fraught reality of life in the West into the language of the census. Indeed, Peck's new guide reads much like a series of almanac entries, and this objective tone accomplishes a corollary goal. It allows him to become an arbiter of regional histories whose sources are largely obscured and seemingly unverified. He doesn't spend a lot of time talking about indigenous Americans, and whether that's surprising or unsurprising given his historical moment, again, this is like the 1830s, his authority conveys certainty that, for example, the objections of tribal nations are more or less a settled question for the colonizing Americans. Quote, by the wise and beneficent arrangement of government, the Indian tribes have nearly all removed to the territories specially allotted for their occupancy west of the Missouri and Arkansas. The grand error committed in past times in relation to the Indians, and which has been the source of incalculable evils to both races, has been the want of definite, fixed, and permanent lines of demarcation betwixt them. Again, this was written in the 1830s, right? Understanding the role that drier, more standard chapter arguments plays in the dissemination of knowledge lets us now return to matters that would better interest Foucault. What happens when you imitate the form of the travel narrative while offering chaos in the place of the stabilizing rhetoric promised by the genre? In some instances, Twain uses arguments which in a vacuum would be well suited to a project along Peck's lines, but Twain continually undermines the stability of the readable arguments with the unpredictability of the accompanying text. Take, for example, the argument for chapter 56, which reads, quote, "Off for San Francisco, Western and Eastern landscapes, the hottest place on earth, summer and winter." In this case, we begin with movement, off to San Francisco, phrased to capture the excitement and triumph of a fresh adventure. We then switch to the type of comparative language that we get in standard travel narratives meant to convey savvy, Western and Eastern landscapes. The ability to compare these two places and the things found within them lends the narrative speaker a sense of broad authority over the land, regardless of location. The next entry, "the hottest place on earth," then provides exactly the sort of hyperbolic tidbit designed to attract readers to the travel narrative. Those sitting at home on the eastern seaboard may never see this place, but they can experience firsthand the perils and tribulations of the wilderness in a manner similar to Zane Grey's notable story Death Valley, whose entire purpose is to subject us, without real risk of course, to the brutal conditions of the arid West. Finally, summer and winter returns to the granular, almanac-level detail supplied by travelers such as J.M. Peck. There's nothing particularly surprising or notable about this chapter argument unless one compares it to the actual text of Roughing It, which diverges wildly from the expectations that Twain's enumerated descriptions set up. In the first case, "Off to San Francisco," which one can barely say without implying an exclamation point, begins with rumination on how boring and uninspired the scenery in California is. Quote, "One of the queerest things I know of is to hear tourists from the States go into ecstasies over the loveliness of ever-blooming California. No land with an unvarying climate can be very beautiful. Change is the handmaiden nature requires to do her miracles with." While the reader is led into this chapter expecting exhilaration, Twain immediately dampens our spirits by talking about how miserably monotonous the landscape is. Rather than being a window into the beauty of the American landscape, the narrative sort of cops out and tells us that we might have been better off staying away. This still reaffirms Twain's value as an explorer and interlocutor who can tell us about the West as we sit comfortably at home, but it does it in a way that's very different from Peck's, because a standard travel narrative generally sells a positive vision of the land being explored as part of its overall project. Twain's mention of the hottest place on earth is also an indictment of the California climate. He begins by segueing into a discussion of Sacramento's overwhelming heat before bringing up Fort Yuma, in his estimation, likely the hottest place on earth. Quote, "The thermometer stays at 120 in the shade there all the time, except when it varies and goes higher. Its occupants get so used to the terrific heat that they suffer without it. There's a tradition that a very, very wicked soldier died there once, and of course went straight to the hottest corner of perdition, and then the next day he telegraphed back for his blankets." This statement demonstrates two techniques essential to the disruption Roughing It accomplishes. Consider for a moment the except in the opening of his statement. Twain says that it stays at 120 all the time before immediately providing an except that undermines the definitiveness of his own words. By phrasing it in a way that linguistically and logically contradicts itself, Twain reminds us that the travel narrative is constantly pressured to revise itself in more and more hyperbolic ways in order to entice readers, sell copy, and manufacture a vision of place in line with the expectations of the producing culture. The lapse into the story about the soldier who calls back from hell for his blankets because he can't handle the cold simply reinforces the absurdity of listening to anything this narrator says at all, and by extension influences how we as readers perceive the engagement tactics, to borrow a current term, common to the genre. However, although Twain is clearly playing with the medium in the above argument, this is not a direct example of the more fundamental violence one finds in unreadable lists such as those found in Borges above. The argument for chapter 20 presents a more concrete example. Quote, The Great American Desert, 40 miles on bones, lakes without outlets, Greeley's remarkable ride, fatal effects of corking a story. The opening of this chapter sounds like standard fare for a Western narrative. Quote, on the 19th day we crossed the Great American Desert, 40 memorable miles of bottomless sand into which the coach wheels sunk from 6 inches to a foot. We worked our passage most of the way across. That is to say, we got out and walked. It was a dreary pull and a long and thirsty one, for we had no water, period, from one extremity of this desert to the other, and the road was white with the bones of oxen and horses. And so far, the chapter's argument lines up with the narrative's ostensible purpose. Here we are privy to a scene of hardship, but also one of American perseverance, and the combination of these two serves to reinforce and to figure common to the genre of the stalwart American braving the wilderness in the name of national and individual growth. But narrator Twain's mind soon wanders its own dusty trail, and the chapter quickly devolves into a running joke involving a story that Twain claims to have heard many times in the West. I will include it in full to avoid the fate of a traveler we will soon discuss. Quote, I can tell you the most laughable thing indeed if you listen to it. Horace Greeley went over this road once. When he was leaving Carson City, he told the driver, Hank Muck, that he had an engagement to lecture at Placerville and was very anxious to go through quick. Hank Muck cracked his whip and started off at an awful pace. The coach bounced up and down in such a terrific way that it jolted the buttons all off Horace's coat and finally shot his head clean through the roof of the stage. And then he yelled at Hank Muck and begged him to go easier and said he wasn't in much of a hurry as he was a while ago. But Hank Muck said, keep your seat, Horace, and I'll get you there on time. And you bet he did, too, what was left of him. I think I can safely say it would be generous to call this story mildly amusing, but the joke ultimately belongs to Twain. In a sequence reminiscent of Connecticut Yankee's humorous lecturer joke, as he says, the one anecdote which I had heard the oftenest and most hated and loathed all my life, roughing its narrator Twain runs into a series of characters who tell him word for word the same Horace Greeley story. Of course, Twain inflicts his suffering on us by including the entire story each time, but on the 5th documented encounter, he pleads with the would-be interlocutor, a stranded traveler they've just saved from the elements, to, quote, spare me only just this once and tell me about young George Washington and his little hatchet for a change. The traveler obliges, but not without consequence. Quote, we were saved, but not so the invalid. In trying to retain the anecdote in his system, he strained himself and died in our arms. This is what the chapter argument refers to as the fatal effects of corking a story, and the effect within the narrative is the same effect as the effect within the argument. Here, Twain interrupts an otherwise ordinary account of the West in order to bring us an anecdote which both disrupts genre expectations and provides commentary on narrative itself. When one encounters the argument, one wonders what the phrase could possibly mean in the context of a trip through the desert. The reassuring stability captured by straightforward arguments such as Peck's above is not only thrown into question, but obliterated, as we are faced with potentially fatal effects stemming from apparent nonsense. While this might seem like a fairly straightforward joke that Twain is playing on the genre and the reader, it is actually a deeper commentary on narrative with two distinct resonances. First, it aligns with Foucault by indicating the impossibility of neatly enumerating the textured reality of the West. While the mind may desire a straightforward accounting a la Peck, the truer reality of the human experience, with all of its oddities, drives, and quirks, is always, to our horror, threatening to break through the veneer of order we constantly seek to impose upon the world. Second, it provides commentary on the role of apocrypha in myth-making. At the end of the chapter, Twain adds a note, unambiguously stating that, quote, the adventure the story celebrates never occurred. But stories have a way of circulating and becoming an encapsulation of an experience that they can't fully articulate. And by the time Twain is telling us the story, and we note, of course, that he can't help himself, just as he can't in Connecticut Yankee, he claims to have heard it 481 or 82 times. The comparison to George Washington and his little hatchet elevates this story to the level of myth. No ordinary myth, but one in parallel with the central component of America's origin story. While we were certainly supposed to treat narrator Twain as an unreliable voice, he also forces us to acknowledge that other stories, ones which more consistently seek to sway public opinion toward a project such as westward expansion, are, in an important way, less honest. Seen from this angle, Roughing It is perhaps less a story about the West than it is a story about how we talk about the West, and its valorization of laziness, greed, and incompetence helps to temper our understandings of the stories we and our nation take as formative. Cheers.